They took the bakery on Hollis Street. They took the van. They took his son, and they did it quietly, through a mediator in a glass-walled room in downtown Halifax, while February sat heavy on the harbor and nobody outside those walls knew a thing had changed. 11 weeks later, a copy of Maclean's lay open on a folding table in a community center in Dartmouth, and the woman standing across from it looked, from the face on the page to the man in the flour-dusted apron, and understood, with a slowness that had nowhere to go, that they were the same person. Stellan did not look up. He had not come to prove anything. They had taken everything a signature could hold. No one had ever thought to ask him what he was actually building. $340. Stellan counted it on the kitchen counter of the apartment that was no longer his, because the number had not changed since the morning before, and counting again was the only thing left to do. The papers had been filed in October. The bakery on Hollis Street, the one he had opened with his father's sourdough starter, and $12,000 borrowed from his uncle in Truro, belonged to Daphne now. The van belonged to Daphne. The family court had granted her primary custody of their son and left him with supervised access 2 evenings a week and every other Saturday. The word supervised sitting in the order the way a splinter sits in a palm, not serious enough for anyone else to see, too present to forget. He did not argue the van. He did not argue the apartment. He said very little in that room, and afterward people would mistake his silence for acceptance, and he would not correct them, because the silence was not acceptance. It was attention. He was paying attention to the shape of what had happened, the same way he paid attention to dough, not forcing it, just watching for what it meant to become. What Daphne did not take was the notebook. It was a brown rhodia, water-stained at the corner, held shut with a length of kitchen twine. His father had started it in Lunenburg in 1987. Recipes, temperatures, notes in the margins about humidity and timing, and the particular stubbornness of rye flour in winter. Stellan had been adding to it since he was 19. Daphne had called it his obsession. She had called the starter culture in the back of the fridge a biohazard. She had called the notebook, more than once, the other woman. "Take your old junk," she said on the last day. So he did. He carried it out in the front pocket of his coat, the way you carry something you have no intention of explaining. The space on Gottingen Street had been a print shop for 40 years before the owner retired and the landlord stopped answering emails. Terence Okafor was 63 and had bought the building in 1998 and managed it the way old men manage things they have stopped needing to impress anyone with. Slowly, honestly, without ceremony. He looked at Stellan through the glass of the front door for a long moment before he opened it. "Your father used to bring bread to my wife when she was sick," Terence said. "She told me once it was the only thing she could taste. Chimo takes your mouth," and he gave it back to her for a morning. He looked at the street and then back. "I'm not running a charity," he said. $700 a month for the back kitchen. You keep it clean. You leave the front counter alone." Stellan moved in that weekend. He slept on a camping mat between the proofing shelf and the wall, and woke to the smell of cold tile and old ink, and the particular silence of a building that has not been used in a while and remembers it. On the third morning, his son Cormac came for his first access visit, wearing his winter coat and carrying a drawing folded into quarters. He was 7 and he had drawn a kitchen, the long counter, the oven window, the one high shelf, and across the top he had printed in careful pencil letters, "Dad's new place." Stellan put it up on the wall above the proofing shelf with a piece of masking tape and stood in front of it longer than he meant to. The woman from the province came on a Tuesday. She introduced herself as Faye Morrow, a child protection and custody evaluator, contracted through the Nova Scotia Department of Community Services. And she said it the way someone reads a job title off a lanyard. She had a bag over one shoulder and a printed checklist, and she moved through the back kitchen with the focused neutrality of someone trained not to react to anything until they had written it down first. She measured the distance between the sleeping mat and the fire exit. She noted the single electric burner. She asked about income. "I'm building toward it," Stellan said. She wrote that down. "And where does the child sleep when he visits?" "There's a cot coming Thursday. And a proper bed frame by the end of the month." She wrote that down too. She had no particular expression, and Stellan gave her no reason to find one. He answered what she asked and let the rest sit. When she left, he went back to the bench and shaped the morning's loaves by hand in the cold, and did not stop until the light outside the high windows went yellow. She came back the following Tuesday, 20 minutes before the scheduled time, and found the back door propped open and Cormac inside, sitting on an overturned milk crate, watching his father score the tops of 4 sourdough loaves with a lame and long, unhurried strokes. The cot was there, made up with a proper blanket. Someone had installed a second smoke detector above the door. A kettle sat on the counter beside 2 mugs, and there was a child's drawing of a dog taped to the side of the proofing shelf, next to the original kitchen drawing from the first visit, slightly crooked and not corrected. Faye set her bag down and began her walk through the exits, the outlets, the temperature of the space, which was warmer than it had been, and smelled of bread instead of old ink. At the bench she moved aside the notebook to check the surface beneath it and found, under a folded tea towel, a sheaf of papers held together with a binder clip. She lifted the top sheet and read the letterhead twice before it arranged itself into meaning. Canadian Intellectual Property Office. Registration Certificate. Proprietor. Stellan Rowe. A trademark. Below it, another. A filing for a process patent, a method of long fermentation temperature control for artisan bread production that the accompanying correspondence described, in the dry language of intellectual property, as novel and non-obvious. There was a letter beneath that from a food science department at Dalhousie. There was a licensing inquiry from a commercial bakery operation in Ontario dated 4 months prior, unanswered. She read the Ontario letter twice. The file she had been handed called this man self-employed, income unverifiable, living situation unstable. The file had not mentioned any of this. The file was beginning, quietly and without fanfare, to describe a different man than the one it claimed to be about. She did not say so. She straightened the papers and set the notebook back on top of them and turned toward the oven, where Stellan had crouched down to Cormac's level and was showing the boy how to listen, palm flat against the oven door, not touching, just close. "Feel the difference?" Stellan said. "That's ready. You'll know. Your hand knows before your head does." Cormac pressed his palm close to the door and his face went serious with concentration, the way children go serious when they've been trusted with something real. Stellan did not look toward the bench. He did not gesture toward the papers or name them, or offer the single sentence that would have answered every question in Faye's file before lunch. He showed his son how to read heat with his hand, the way his own father had shown him in Lunenburg 30 years ago, in a kitchen that smelled like this one, the knowledge moving from one set of hands to the next, without needing to be explained. Faye had stopped writing. She was not sure when. Her phone buzzed against the outside of her bag. A message from her supervisor, flagged with the red marker they used for time-sensitive matters. Availability hearing on the Beaumont file has been moved forward at the petitioner's request. Earliest possible. Need your recommendation in advance. She read it twice. She did not yet know that 8 days was all that stood between the life Stellan was building in a cold kitchen on Gottingen Street and the thing closing behind him in a courtroom on Spring Garden Road. She knew only that someone with access to a court calendar had reached into it and pulled a date forward, and that people did not do that unless the current trajectory was running against them somewhere. They would rather no one look. The ground, when it shifts under you slowly enough, does not feel like it is moving. It feels like you are the one who has misremembered where you were standing. Stellan understood this now, looking back at the decade behind him. He and his former business partner, a man named Graham Leith, had opened the Hollis Street Bakery 6 years earlier with a handshake and matching investments and a genuine belief that what they were making was worth making. Graham had the financing connections and the front-of-house ease and the ability to charm a room. Stellan had the recipes, the process, the intellectual architecture of everything the bakery actually was. The trademarks were in Stellan's name because Stellan had filed them the way you file things you've built with your hands, because it has not occurred to you yet that the person standing beside you is measuring their exit. Then Cormac was born. Then Daphne's mother got sick in Moncton, and Daphne drove out every 3rd week, and someone had to be home. And so Stellan stepped back from the supplier relationships and the licensing conversations he had been pursuing quietly on the bakery's behalf. His name stayed on the trademarks because no one could take them without his signature. On paper, however, he became what the family court would later describe as a secondary income earner, with no verifiable revenue stream. Daphne had known about the Ontario inquiry. He understood that now. She had seen the letter on the kitchen counter in September and said nothing. She had filed in November, 7 weeks before the licensing conversation was scheduled to resume. She had refinanced the shared line of credit in her name the previous spring. She had the temporary custody order by December. Each step had landed before the one development that would have changed the financial picture entirely had the chance to become real. He had thought the timing was coincidence and bad luck. It was the only timing there had ever been. The town behaved the way towns behave when a story gets there before you do. A wholesale flour supplier he had bought from for 4 years went quiet on his account without explanation. A restaurateur he had supplied through the bakery stopped responding to his messages. People from Cormac's school circle looked at him sideways in the parking lot. The particular look that means the version of you they've been given is not the one that will serve you well here. He did not chase any of it. He put his $340 into a flour order and 2 bags of salt and a replacement proofing basket, and he kept the trademarks and the notebook under the counter. And he got up before 5 every morning because the bread did not care what the file said about him. Daphne tightened access by text. She moved the Tuesday evening window to a 40-minute slot that cost him the transit time there and back for half an hour with his son. She wrote that Cormac had a cold. She wrote that Cormac had homework. She wrote that it was simply better this way, and she wrote it the way someone writes something they have rehearsed until it no longer requires thought. Stellan read each message at the bench. He did not write back what he was thinking. He wrote Cormac a letter instead, about the sourdough starter, how it had been alive for 37 years. How it had survived a move from Lunenburg to Halifax, and a winter when the heat in his father's kitchen had gone out. How it ate and breathed and remembered everything. How there was nothing in the world like something that keeps going, because keeping going is what it knows how to do. He did not put a single word about Cormac's mother in it, not one, though he could have filled a page and meant every word. Faye came back on a Thursday for what she called a secondary assessment visit. She stood in the doorway of the back kitchen with her bag on her shoulder and her clipboard down at her side. "What are you going to raise him on?" she asked. It was not on the form. It was the question underneath the form. Stellan wiped his hands on his apron. He did not cite the trademark filings or the Ontario letter or the Dalhousie correspondence sitting under the notebook on the bench. He pulled back the cloth covering the small rack of test loaves at the back of the counter. 8 different fermentation trials, each labeled in marker with a date and a temperature and a hydration percentage, and let her look at them, the way a man lets the work speak for itself when words have been used against him for long enough. "On this," he said, "and on what I know how to do." She looked at the rack longer than the visit required. She left without writing anything in the notes column she always filled, which was its own kind of note. Graham came on a Wednesday night, pulling up in a new truck that looked wrong against the empty street. He had not stood in the same room as Stellan in 18 months, and there was the hesitation of an old friendship that has passed through something neither person entirely chose. "It's moving," Graham said, once he was inside. "The Ontario group, they want the full licensing package, the process, the trademarks, the technical documentation. They want your name on the launch. They've been talking to a journalist at Maclean's who covers food innovation. Cover story. The guy who cracked long fermentation temperature control, working out of a kitchen in Halifax. That's you, Stellan. That's what they want to print." He stopped, then. "Here's what I came to say in person. The non-disclosure runs through close. I cannot confirm your stake, the valuation, any piece of it before the announcement without triggering a buyout clause that kills the whole thing. I drove here to say that to your face because you should hear it from someone who knows what it cost you." He spread his hands. "The close is in 8 days. The Maclean's cover goes the same morning. After that, I can say everything. Before that, I legally can't say a word." Stellan stood at the bench and he understood what Graham was telling him and the thing underneath what Graham was telling him. The way he had learned to hear the second conversation inside a first one. There was a custody hearing coming. One sentence from him about the licensing deal and what the trademarks were actually worth would turn the financial picture entirely inside out before the week was done. He could have Cormac back, proper access, proper standing, before the Maclean's issue had been on newsstands a day. All it would cost was Graham's 12-year deal, and the trust of the man standing in front of him, and the quiet dignity of his own work reduced to leverage. "Then we don't say it," Stellan said. Graham looked at him. "You could lose him waiting," he said. "You understand that? You could do everything right and lose your kid for it." "I could lose him a number of ways," Stellan said. "That one I couldn't come back from." Faye had returned to collect a folder she'd left on the counter, and she stood at the far edge of the parking lane in the dark and watched through the kitchen window as the man in the good truck pressed his hand to Stellan's shoulder at the door, the grip of something old and unresolved and still standing. She saw that there was a story here considerably larger than a cold kitchen on Gottingen Street. Her instinct, the one 15 years on the job had sharpened to something she did not always want to use, told her she was missing something important. It also told her she was choosing to miss it, that she wanted Stellan to be what she was beginning to believe he was, and she stood in the cold and reminded herself, the way she had always had to remind herself, that wanting a thing to be true was the most efficient way she knew to misread a file. She read the original file again the next morning. The initial assessment that had established the terms of the custody order, she read it the way you reread a sentence that has started, overnight, to sound like something else. It had been completed in 9 days. Her own assessments took 6 weeks minimum, because 6 weeks was what honest ones required. Both mandatory parent interviews were noted as complete, but neither had a transcript attached. The home study had 2 photographs where the form required a minimum of 8. The collateral contacts, Cormac's teacher, the family physician, a named neighbor, were listed as unreachable on the first attempt and never followed up. It was a file assembled by someone moving fast on purpose, and she had been on this job long enough to know that fast on purpose meant someone had needed it finished before a careful person had the chance to look at it. She drove to the house in Armdale and sat across from Daphne at the kitchen table and asked the questions she was required to ask, in the order she was required to ask them, and Daphne answered them with the ease of someone who had prepared the answers a long time before the questions arrived, until Faye asked about the unanswered Ontario letter, about the trademark filings, about the timeline. The ease went thin. "I wouldn't be the one to speak to any of that," Daphne said. She set her coffee cup down with a deliberateness that had nothing to do with the coffee. "I'll say this once because you seem like someone who would rather not learn it the hard way. There are people with long relationships with this court and with the department you work for. Graham Leith is one of them. He is very interested in how this matter concludes. It would be worth your while to think about that before you spend more of your professional hours on a file you were asked to finalize time ago." It was said pleasantly, the way a door is closed pleasantly, with weight and without noise. Faye wrote nothing in her notes. She did not need to write down a thing she was not going to forget. Cormac appeared in the hallway, shy of the unfamiliar person in the kitchen and then not shy at all, the way children stop being shy all at once, like a light switching over. "Are you the lady who's going to decide where I live?" he asked. "I'm the person who helps the judge understand things," Faye said. He considered this with the gravity of someone who had been thinking about it. "My dad fixes things," he said. "Not like broken stuff. Like, he fixed the starter. It was dying, and he fixed it, and now it's been alive for a really long time. He said it was older than me by a lot. He said some things just need someone who knows how to listen." He dropped his voice a register. "And he never says anything bad about my mom. Even when I ask him to take my side, he just says everybody loves me, and that's the important part. He says it the exact same way every time I ask. Children do not know which of their sentences are the ones that land." Faye carried that one to the car and sat with her hands on the wheel for a while, before she trusted herself to start it. That evening, pulling the original file to scan a clean copy into her working records, the system opened the access log the way it always did and the way almost no one ever read. She read it. The file had been opened 14 times in the past 6 weeks and edited on 3 separate occasions, each edit from an account that was not hers, not her supervisor's, not the original assessor's, not any account she could match to anyone in the department. Someone was inside the file. Someone had been quietly adjusting its contents while she worked the case in good faith and in the open, and neither of them had known the other was there. The woman who arrived at the Gottingen Street kitchen on a Friday morning was past 60, 5, and carried a manila envelope against her chest with both hands the way you carry something that has cost you considerably to bring this far. Stellan did not know her. Faye, who arrived separately and found her waiting in the parking lane, had not been expecting her either. "My name is Elspeth Leith," the woman said. "Graham's mother." She said it the way you say a thing you have rehearsed, but not come to terms with. "I don't have anyone to give this to except you," she said to Faye. "I've been carrying it for 2 months and I am too old and too tired to keep carrying it in the right direction and still go wrong." Inside the envelope was a financial disclosure from 18 months ago, a set of printed messages, a handwritten note in someone's compressed, careful print. The disclosure showed the trademark portfolio and the Ontario licensing projection, assessed by an independent firm. Daphne had commissioned the assessment herself, 7 months before the separation filing. The number on the assessment was large enough that Faye went quiet for a moment. Daphne had known exactly what those trademarks would be worth, and, to within a quarter, when the messages ran between Daphne and Graham over the preceding year. Close before the Ontario deal announces, one of them read, "Once it's public, he's not a guy in a rented kitchen anymore. Before that, he's got nothing anyone can put on paper. Graham holds the supplier relationships. Between us, we can make it look like the bakery was his idea, and Stellan's name is just on some old filings. Timing is what matters here." The handwritten note was worse. It was in Graham's print, addressed to the original assessor by name. And it was brief and plain and left nothing to interpret. The man's practice had a debt, a balloon payment due in the spring, and the note described what would happen with that payment in exchange for an assessment filed fast and filed light on detail. Elspeth held the envelope while Faye read it, and she did not look at anything in particular, and when Faye looked up she said, "Graham is my son. I have loved him for 67 years and I will love him until I die, and he did this and I cannot find a way to hold both of those things in the same hand anymore." Her voice was flat in the way a long road goes flat. "Use it, whatever it costs either of us. Use it." She pressed the envelope into Faye's hands and folded Faye's fingers over it with her own, and then she walked back to her car in the February morning and did not look back once. For 15 years Faye had lived in the careful corridor between the parties, neutral, precise, a technician of files and documentation and professional distance. She was not in that corridor now, and she knew it. The knowing arrived the way real knowledge arrives, not as a revelation, but as an admission of something already seen. She knew which side of this she was standing on. She also knew, with complete clarity, what standing there was going to do to the service contract that funded her office, which renewed in the spring, and which a number of people with long institutional memories had just reminded her was not permanent. She drove to the kitchen to tell Stellan. It was not an official visit. They both understood that the moment she stepped through the back door. He made tea that sat between them on the counter and went cold while neither of them touched it, the steam thinning and disappearing while they sat on 2 stools, and the silence did what some silences do, which is hold a great deal more than words would have. The motion arrived the following week through proper channels, in proper language, structured by someone paid carefully to structure such things. It requested that the evaluator be formally removed from the matter for conflict of interest, citing unscheduled visits to the respondent's residence, and contact with collateral parties outside the approved assessment protocol, and describing, in a phrase chosen by someone who knew how to choose them, her demonstrated partiality toward the respondent. It was signed by the same firm that handled the commercial interests of Graham Leith's development partners. Attached to the back was a single sentence, noting that the evaluator's departmental contract came up for review in April. It was not a threat in any language that could be brought into a room and examined. It did not need to be. Stellan heard about the motion the same afternoon Faye did, because a small city keeps its secrets poorly and bad news in particular moves fast. He drove to her building and waited in the parking lot in the cold the way Elspeth had waited in his, because there are debts you settle in the same currency they were lent. When she came out he told her to step back, to recuse herself and give them whatever they needed to hear and let the file go. He told her he would find another way to fight it because he had always found another way. "I'm not going to be the reason they take your work from you," he said. "You've given 15 years to this." She looked at him for a moment longer than the moment required. "You have spent this entire time Putting someone else's ceiling above your own head, she said. Graham's deal. Cormac's name kept out of your mouth when using it would have ended this. And now mine. She shook her head. No, I read files true. That's the only thing I know how to do that matters. I'm going to read this one true, and I'm going to put my name on the bottom of it, and I'm going to let April be whatever April is going to be. She filed the new recommendation the next morning. It rested on what she had documented with her own eyes and confirmed through the access logs and substantiated with the contents of Elspeth's envelope, and it recommended a full restoration of the father's custodial rights, pending the modification hearing. She signed it knowing precisely what it might cost. Her hand did not hesitate. That weekend, Stellan repaired the display case she had mentioned once, offhandedly 3 weeks earlier, a small bakery-style display cabinet she had found at an estate sale in Lower Sackville, and kept meaning to get looked at. The hinge had been failing on one side and the glass panel had a crack running from the lower corner. He did not ask if she still wanted it done. He had not forgotten. He collected it on Saturday morning, resoldered the hinge, replaced the glass panel with a piece he sourced from a glazier on Barrington, oiled the latch and had it back on her doorstep by 4 in the afternoon, with a note that read only, good as it was. Better, maybe. She found it Sunday morning and stood with one hand resting on the repaired hinge for a moment before she went inside. The hearing and the announcement were going to fall in the same week. Stellan could feel both of them coming, the way you feel a change in the air pressure before a storm rolls in off the Atlantic. Not the storm itself, but the quality of the air just before. He did not know which would arrive first. He did not know what shape he would be in when the week was done. Graham moved the hearing forward a second time, spending whatever institutional goodwill he had remaining to drag the date into the same Thursday that the Maclean's issue had been scheduled to go to print. The calculation was clean and simple. Close the legal matter while the file still described Stellan Rowe as a man living in a rented kitchen with a camping mat and no verifiable income. Resolve it before a single word about the Ontario deal could enter the public record and rewrite every number in the case. He did not know, because it had not occurred to him to ask the right question about the man he was working against, that he had just scheduled the hearing for the exact morning the rest of the country was going to learn who that man actually was. The night before, Stellan was not thinking about the hearing. He was thinking about the starter, the one his father had kept in Lunenburg through 4 decades of Nova Scotia winters, the one Stellan had carried to Halifax in a glass jar wrapped in a tea towel the day after the funeral, the one that had been living in the back corner of the proofing shelf on Gottingen Street through all of this without knowing any of it, because starters do not know anything except how to keep going. Cormac was there, sitting on his milk crate in his winter coat because the kitchen held the cold at night, watching his father feed the starter with the focused attention of someone being trusted with a ceremony. "Can I do it?" Cormac asked. Stellan handed him the jar and showed him the weight of flour to add, the temperature of the water, the slow fold that woke the culture without stressing it. Cormac worked with his tongue between his teeth, and the seriousness of someone who understood this was real. "Is it going to be okay?" Cormac asked. He was not asking about the starter. "It's going to be fine," Stellan said. "It always figures out how to keep going. That's what it knows." Cormac looked at the jar for a moment and then up at his father, deciding something. "Okay," he said. "I believe you." Stellan held that moment the way he held the notebook, carefully with both hands, in a place it would not blow away. Across the city, a press run confirmed and a Maclean's cover locked for the morning, unalterable by anyone remaining with access to a phone and a contact at the printing plant. The quiet innovator behind one of the country's most significant food technology licensing agreements in a decade was about to have his name and his face printed on 250,000 copies. 8 days after a deal had begun to close, and there was no clock left anywhere that Graham Leith's money could reach in time. The courtroom in the Halifax Law Courts building was the kind of room that makes everything that happens inside it feel inevitable. The high ceilings and the particular light designed to make the case seem like it had been decided before anyone walked in. Daphne's legal team told the familiar version of the story, the one that had been polished over months until every rough edge was gone, and they told it smoothly and at length. Unstable living situation, no verifiable income, a man in a rented kitchen with a camping mat, and an expired wholesale account and a notebook full of his father's recipes that no one had been able to monetize in 6 years of trying. They had photographs of the kitchen, taken on the one occasion they had had access to it, shot from angles that made the proofing shelf look like clutter and the camping mat look like evidence of something. They read the original assessment aloud in the measured tone of something being treated as settled record. They were still reading when the sound started, a low scattered chiming from the gallery. Phones lighting and buzzing in the pockets and bags of the dozen people in the public seats, the soft irreversible noise of something going public that cannot be taken back. The Maclean's piece had posted at 9 sharp, The Quiet Science of Stellan Rowe. How a Halifax baker's father-son notebook became Canada's most talked about food technology licensing deal. The cover image was him in his apron at the bench on Gottingen Street, the brown Rhodia notebook open in front of him, the morning light from the high window coming in at an angle that made the whole thing look like something worth keeping. The back door of the courtroom opened. Elspeth Leith walked the full length of the aisle and did not look at her son once, all the way to the front. She entered the printed messages and the financial disclosure, and Graham's handwritten note, and she said, under oath and in a voice that leveled every other sound in the room, what Daphne had known, and when she had known it, and what Graham had purchased and from whom. Graham followed her, the non-disclosure having expired at the hour of the announcement, and confirmed under oath what the trademarks were worth and what the founder's share of the licensing arrangement came to. And the number, he said quietly into the microphone, changed the atmospheric pressure of the room in the way that numbers of that size do. Daphne was not looking at any of it. She was looking at the copy of the magazine that had appeared on the table between the parties, at the notebook in the photograph, at the brown Rhodia with the water stain at the corner and the kitchen twine around it, the one she had called an obsession, the one she had told him to take when she was finished with the marriage. She understood, all at once and far too late to be useful, that the thing she had sent out the door was the thing that had built everything she had spent 14 months carefully taking. She saw it whole and plainly, and the seeing did not change a single thing. When the judge asked whether he had anything to add, Stellan stood. I didn't want the bakery, he said. I didn't want the van. They could have kept all of it. The only thing I came to this building for was my son. That's all it's ever been. Nothing in that magazine changes a word of that. The court restored joint custody, full and equal, effective that day. It also ordered a review of the original assessment that everyone present understood would not end quietly, or well, for the people whose names were attached to it. Across the aisle, Graham Leith's position was already gone. Not loudly. The Leith Group's institutional partners were reading the court transcript on their phones in the gallery before the session had even closed, and one by one, the return calls they had always previously made stopped going out. Business ends the way trust ends, not in an argument but in a silence that stretches past the point where both people know it's over. The wall that had stood between Stellan and the woman who had been assigned to assess him simply was not there anymore when the session concluded. He looked across the courtroom and found Faye already looking. Neither of them spoke. The look lasted a moment longer than any look between two people, with no remaining professional relationship needs to, and that was the whole of it, and it was enough. Daphne kept the house in Armdale. She moved through its rooms carrying the particular weight of having known exactly what she was doing and having done it anyway, which is the heavier thing to carry than a wrong done in heat or confusion. Heat and confusion can be forgiven. Calculation sits differently on the chest. Stellan kept the kitchen on Gottingen Street. He didn't need it. He could have bought the building, or the block, or found something considerably more practical now. That practical had stopped being a constraint. He kept it because his father had taught him that the relationship between a person and the place they do their best work is not a matter of economics, and he was not going to let a hard year teach him something worse than what his father had already taught him something better. He brought Terence Okafor on as a proper silent partner with a stake that would outlive both of them, and told him the rent was zero effective immediately, and the arrangement was a gift, not a transaction, and Terence should stop trying to find a polite way to argue with it. It came out, eventually, the way these things come out, that Stellan had set up an education trust in Cormac's name the year the boy was born. Not from the licensing money, from his own founder's savings, before the filing, before any of the trouble had begun. Whatever happened to the trademarks, whatever happened in any courtroom, his son was going to have something that could not be taken, because it had never been listed as an asset. He had done it quietly and told no one, and had not thought of it in months, because he had not needed to think about it. It had been there the whole time, the same way the notebook had been there, waiting. Cormac taped a new drawing to the proofing shelf on the first Saturday after the hearing, pressing the corner of the tape down carefully so it would stay. 3 figures, his father at the bench, himself in the middle, and a woman off to one side with a folder under her arm, drawn with a particular attention that children give to people they have decided belong in the picture. She was slightly smaller than the others, which is not how children draw people they find unimportant. It is how they draw people they are still figuring out. On the bench below the drawing, the notebook lay open for the first time. In months, the kitchen twine. Off at last, the pages turned to a note his father had written in Lunenburg 20 years ago, in pencil gone soft and gray. In the margin beside a hydration calculation for a January rye, in the small, careful print of a man who wrote things down because he meant them. If it's still here in the morning, it was worth keeping. Faye came by on a Saturday. Not for the department. No bag, no clipboard. The repaired display case was visible through the window of her small office across the street, the replaced glass catching the March light cleanly. Stellan handed her a coffee at the kitchen door, and this time it was hot, and she wrapped both hands around it and did not offer a reason for being there, and he did not ask for one. "Cormac's inside," he said. "He wants to show you how to feed the starter. He's been practicing the explanation." "I'll need the explanation," she said. "I've never been good at anything that required patience." "He'll sort you out," Stellan said. Neither of them said the larger thing. There was no longer any particular need to. They stood in the open door of the kitchen with the March cold at their backs and the warmth of the ovens ahead of them, and the silence between them was the kind that does not press to be filled, the kind that has earned its own quiet, and that was all of it. And that was the whole of it. They had taken the bakery, they had taken the van, they had taken his son for a season, on paper, with the help of men who knew how to make paper do what money asked it to. But the thing that mattered most had never been written anywhere, which was precisely why no document had ever been able to reach it. It had been in his hands every morning at 5 o'clock, and in a water-stained notebook on a proofing shelf, and in a boy who had pressed his palm to a warm oven door and learned to trust what his hand knew before his head could say it. Stellan had only ever needed someone to look past what the file said and see what was actually there. Here is the question, and it will not land the same way for everyone who hears it. If someone spent a year taking apart everything you built, piece by piece, with planning and paperwork and people they had paid to help them, and then watched you build it all back from nothing, would you find a way to let them back into your life, or would you leave them with exactly what they chose? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone. If this story stayed with you, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.